No, it was. I mean, it was good. I enjoyed it, but yeah, a bit tiring in some respects. Yeah. Did you go back to the States for
Not this
Christmas?
time, no. We had gone back in November because I gave a talk at my nephew's school
Oh,
during
nice.
the enhancement week in California. So I saw family then very briefly, and then this year for Christmas, stayed here, went windsurfing a few times, and
Oh,
just took
nice.
it easy. So
I can
yeah,
imagine that must have been pretty cold. Where'd you go? Where did you go windsurfing?
Whitstable.
Oh, Wintersport. Oh, okay.
Yeah. No, winter wetsuits.
Yeah, yeah, oh, yeah. I suppose so. Yeah.
Yeah, so and
Um,
then did some my own work, research, and just
yeah.
had a nice time.
Yeah, because you started working on a new project now, haven't you?
Yes, I have.
This is the gardens as and their relationship with health in the
Yes,
ancient world.
yeah. So what it is because I normally would work on ancient medicine, and I looked at medical material culture, medical tools, spaces, and then about 5 years ago, I was trying to think. I just completed a book, and was finishing up some other papers. I was trying to think of a new project, and I just happened to turn and look at a painting or a painting of the fresco of the garden in Livia's villa at Prima Porta, and just thought, how nice. I wonder what it was like to be a Roman in that garden. And then I just started to think, well, would they have considered this a healthy space? And that's just really what has led on to my current research, which is looking at how gardens were experienced, but also how they were healthy. So the point of how they were experienced is through the senses. So what you would smell, see, hear, taste, and touch. And I'd also been working at that time on a paper on taste and health and archaeology. So that sort of led into the sensory aspect of this. But when I started learning about the philosophy of how the senses worked, Epicureans and Stoics talk about first the atomic system, where if you look at an atomist, an ancient atomist would actually think that everything was made up of tiny, indivisible particles, and they constantly float through the air. And then they touch your eyes or your ears, and these atoms are shaped to either go into your eyes or your ears or your mouth. And then when they actually enter, they would affect the humors. So it's actually seeing something, for example, actually it would physically come into you, and then that would affect your balance. So what's a pleasant sight? How would that affect your humors? What are bad sights? How would that make you unhealthy? Or what are pleasant sounds that are healthy, or unhealthy sounds? So, and then reading further, there's a lot of ancient literature, Roman writers in their letters. For example, Pliny the Elder talks about how he likes to get out of the city. It's unhealthy, it's noisy, he can't think, he's too busy. Just like we complain about today, he's fortunate enough to have a couple of villas, one by the seaside, one up in the mountains, two by Lake Como. So he could go there, but he talks about them actually being healthy. He speaks about the air being healthy. He talks about how quiet it is and how he's able to both think and exercise. So there's a relationship between the body and the mind as well. So.
Yeah, I was going to say because I imagine talking about gardens. I mean, there's like obviously the physical healthy aspect of it in terms of like fresh air and as you say exercise, but I guess it does, there's a lot of it also that's about mental health as well. Gardens being very calm places, I suppose, as you were saying, like with the image as well, very colourful spaces as well. Has there been much in the way of work on mental health in the ancient world?
There is. It's more recently, there are, but mainly what people tend to look at are things like frenetics, when people go mad and what causes madness. So that's what most people have looked at. How do you go from a state of balanced mental health to one that's imbalanced? I'm more interested in how do you maintain that balance, and rather than looking at the frenzy or the madness, what's calm. So that aspect hasn't been looked at as much, but there is work on mental health in the ancient world, and a lot of it has to do with the humors and balance as well, because there's so much on humoral balance. So if, for those who don't know, the Greeks and Romans basically believed that the body was made of four humors. I'm oversimplifying this, but generally it's phlegm, yellow bile, black bile, and blood. And a healthy person and a healthy mind would have a balance of these. And then if something smells bad, it might cause an imbalance, or if something's too noisy, it could cause an imbalance, or
that was still common thought until like the Middle Ages or later? Or am I wrong?
Later, early modern period. And actually we still see it, you know.
Okay.
You know, if you look at alternative medical systems today, they do talk about balance.
Yeah.
So we still do it on a general level, but it's, and there's more now on environmental psychology, where they're talking about people going outside and just trying to relax and get that balance back.
Yeah.
They won't relate it to the humours, of course.
Because it was interesting actually, like when I was teaching around Britain last term and talking about the idea of like the military community, and one of those things that you think about like mentally, obviously how people get bound together in these communities. But it's just very interesting, like the effect it had. Like I don't know, I remember seeing somebody at track actually do a paper years ago where they were talking about the mentality of soldiers going into battle, and it's one of those things that I suppose most people don't think about, like just thinking about kind of the mental aspect of it. The ancient world, nobody thinks about a Roman soldier perhaps suffering from like post-traumatic stress disorder, but they must have done, surely.
Yeah, there's some interesting literature by a man named Censorinus. He was a 2nd century Roman writer. And he wrote a book about somebody for their birthday. And there's this wonderful passage in it where he says, people think that Roman soldiers use music to call out commands. But that's not the point. The music is there to keep them focused, keep them active, and keep them from being scared. So he's actually talking about it. So it does talk, it's just one passage, but it's interesting that at least somebody out there recognizes the fact that going into battle is probably scary. And
just on a quick side to that, it's very interesting because I remember in the PGCHE they were talking about things you can do when you put people into groups in seminars and you get them to talk. Really, one thing that helps is to play music while they're doing it, because it means that it's slightly different, all very different, but it's still interesting how they say that for one, it means they can't really hear each other in groups so much. They can just hear the people around them, but also it makes them feel a little bit more calmer, I guess. It's just very interesting how that physically things like music play a role, I guess. I mean, going back to the sensory stuff that you were saying, because that's a massively growing field now, isn't it? I mean, there's a lot that's being done on the senses now. I mean, I know Eleanor Betts does quite a bit on that as well. I mean, it's striking because I was saying this to students before as well. I suppose it's very difficult for us to imagine what it was like walking through a Roman town or in the Roman world. A while ago, I was reading a biography of Charles Dickens, and the author was saying in that if you went back to Dickens' time, like you were transported back to like when he was a boy, your first reaction when you got there would probably be to throw up because you would go into like sensory overload from particularly all the smells that it would just be so alien and you'd be so unused to it, and even I suppose like the taste of food and things would have been radically different, and that would have it's one of those things that I guess that in the past people just didn't really give much consideration. Do you think sometimes that people think about the Roman world, senses in the Roman world, it suffers a little bit perhaps in the past from people doing that whole thing about they think about the Romans as being quite like us, so people hadn't taken that step to sort of think actually the experience of being in the Roman world would be quite different, like for the senses.
I definitely think that was probably it, and like a lot of this I think developed out of anthropology and then the history of the senses, and then people who study the senses from a philosophical perspective and how they work, so it's been growing slowly like that. But it's always hard when you try and put yourself into the past. You have to think of all that stuff around you and the different smells, and it's hard to imagine if you're not familiar with that. Everything's very sanitized for us. And, but then after a while, you do acclimatize to these things. But the Romans themselves do talk about bad smells, and it's a cause for disease. It's everywhere. The more you look, there's so much on the senses just in passing, it's mentioned over and over again. And then if you take that to the archaeology, you can see where trash was dumped and that might have a smell. Or you can, by looking at the gardens, you can see what was grown there. Would it have a mild or a strong smell? You can try and recreate that. Or sounds, walls are up. What sort of sounds might they've heard or seeing what they would have seen. So because
it's obviously saying because it links very strongly to people's emotional and mental state as well, particularly like I suppose like sights, smells, etc. They would trigger memories and emotions as well. So it is a really fascinating area.
It just goes in so many different directions.
It's like even like when you smell something like garum and you've never smelled it before, you get hit by that smell and you're like, wow, and then you think like in some areas this is a really common smell. As you say, you'd probably acclimatise to it after a while, but it's just very it's striking like how pungent that smell actually is as well, and how I suppose quite overpowering the level of particularly smells would have been in the ancient world. As you say, it's so hard to imagine nowadays because we're so sanitized. But you can imagine as well that someone like Pliny leaving the city, going to his garden, like you can notice nowadays if you go from a city to I don't know the Peak District or somewhere, like the difference in the air quality.
Yeah.
But I imagine back then it might have been even more notable because I suppose it's probably slightly different because we obviously have more pollution nowadays. But even still, like because of the sheer volume of kind of smells that are probably attacking them, going to somewhere like your villa in the countryside, it probably would make them feel a lot more kind of at ease and a lot more relaxed.
That, but also apart from smells, just because we are talking about air quality, another thing they do talk about, this is something that's just coming out in the World Archaeology, a paper I wrote, was looking at how the Romans understood pure air, because it's, smells definitely come into it, and smoke and things, but also movement. How's the air moving? Because if it's stagnant, like stagnant water, it's not doing you any good. So they do talk about poor air is often associated with poor water as well. So where you have stagnant water, you'll have stagnant air, no movement. So movement seems to be a big thing in identifying what good air is.
Okay.
So, yeah. And there are certain colors associated with that as well. So blue, whites, are indicators that there's movement, and then green for green plants is also an indicator of health. So,
Okay. Has there been a lot of work, because obviously now like archaeobotany is a growing area of study. Do people do, that stuff tends to cover quite large areas. Do people actually manage to do anything like that on particular gardens, or is rebuilding like the image of, say, someone like Pliny's garden largely based off what he says in the text?
It's a bit of both. There are, especially for Pompeii, that's where most of the work is being done. It's mainly been done it started off by Wilhelmina Jaszczemski, and she was one of the first to actually start looking at what was grown in gardens. Some of it's through the pollen samples, some of it's through the carbonized fruits that have survived. And then there are more Italian archaeologists doing that for the area surrounding Pompeii. Pompeii itself, there's some gardens that have been looked at, but not all of them. It just depends on when they were excavated, the quality of the excavation and the survival. But there's more material coming out. But what's nice about it is what they're finding correlates with what's been written, and also what most of the paintings show, unless they're exotic scenes. Okay. So there is a correlation, which is nice. It matches up.
Yeah.
So.
How did you come to focus on medicine in the ancient world? Because you did your thesis, if I'm right, on medical equipment in the army on the frontiers?
Medical care in the Roman army and the frontiers. The question for that was just everything I read about medical care. I just kept saying, there was this uniform system, and nobody ever said, well, what the evidence was. So, I just wanted to know what the evidence was. And actually, there isn't enough evidence to support the idea that it was uniform. So what I think was going on was people were probably bringing their own medical practices with them, because you have units coming from all over the empire. So, but there isn't enough evidence to actually say there was this entire uniform system. When you look at the inscriptions, where the medical tools came from. So,
I suppose as well it's a case of things like supply, I guess, as well, of certain things. You're not going to have access to certain materials, so you have to make do with what you've got, particularly up in the frontier zone.
Yeah, exactly.
What sort of things did you get out of that in terms of observation wise?
Well, one interesting thing was it seemed to be where most of the evidence was coming from was auxiliary forts from Gaul and Spain, where we can actually identify which units were stationed. The inscriptions and the medical tools were mainly from those units. Then you have units from all over the place, everywhere else, where they have no evidence archaeological. That could change. Maybe some more excavations will reveal that. but at the moment it was really slim, so it's just quite interesting. And then also I started looking at the deposition of where these tools were found. A lot of them are found, not all of them, but a number were found in places that were either for ritual or burial. So what does that say about understandings about how these tools were used? Are they considered polluted? There's a lot that I took off, and the big controversial issue that came out of that was my final chapter was questioning whether or not we've correctly identified spaces that were identified as Roman hospitals.
Okay.
Because the first one was identified, I think it was 1908, somewhere early 20th century, in Neuss in Germany, and there was one room in a courtyard-style building which had 12 medical tools in it, and therefore the archaeologist identified that as a hospital. Yet all the other finds from that building actually make it seem more like it could have either been a barracks or a workshop, and there are medical tools scattered throughout the rest of that Roman fortress. So if you're going to use that one room and saying, well, here's the hospital, and then other buildings that look similar were then identified as hospitals. But when you start looking at the artifacts that were found in them, most of them could be workshops. Maybe it was a room where a doctor was stationed. I don't know what they were, but I just don't think we've identified them. I can't say for sure.
Yeah. It's interesting, though, just how something like that, because is that then something where people use that then subsequently as a template for the building?
Yes, yeah.
It's always fascinating how those things, you go back to the original report and suddenly you're like, it doesn't quite. There are questions over this, but it just passes into the scholarship, and it just gets used over and over, and how it keeps repeating. Did they actually have doctors?
Yeah, they do. And we know that from the inscriptions, and there's some letters, but again, they're not found in every fortification. But technically, there was supposed to be medical care for soldiers, but my argument is whether or not it was the same type of medical care. Are they using Greco-Roman medicine? Are they bringing their own traditions with them? Did everybody want it? There is sort of this idea that part of being a Roman soldier was to withstand the pains, die a good death.
Did doctors in the army have different titles to doctors outside of the army, or could somebody go into the army, be a doctor in the army, and then leave the army and be a doctor elsewhere, or is it
Okay. And it seems like, again, this is just coming from the literature, and whether anybody, first of all, for ancient medicine, anybody could say they were a doctor. They don't have, there's no sense of formal training, but if you really wanted to study, you could go to places which had good libraries. You could, or be an apprentice, and go study with Galen, or hang out with a doctor that was known for being good, and then they could teach their students that way. And then one of the suggestions was, move around so you can learn about different diseases in different areas. Galen says go to the army because you can, again, learn about different diseases where you may come across injuries due to weapons or whatever. So you could get different training that way. There are most of the titles for doctors you find everywhere, except for there's two that seem specifically military. Amiles medicus, which just means doctor. Soldier doctor, so we don't know whether that meant it was a soldier and a doctor, or was it somebody who was a soldier and then became a doctor? It's impossible. And the other one's a medicus ordinarius, but they're ordinary, it's a different rank. Okay. So, but there aren't too many of those. So.
Just makes you wonder now, because one of my in my thesis, one of my Mithraic initiates from the 4th century, early 4th century probably, is a doctor.
Oh, okay.
Because there's like a thing that happens in Gaul where the cult becomes increasingly regionalised. Mithras seems to become increasingly associated with healing there.
Oh, wow,
because the temples, because in the Mithraic narrative, he's associated with springs.
Yeah.
You get that in a lot of cults, but Mithrae are often built close to springs. But in Gaul, it's interesting because they get put near to springs or other natural water sources. But then quite often, subsequently alongside that, you get things like bathhouses constructed there. And then it seems that you increasingly over time, that things like votives to do with illnesses appear near them as well. And then suddenly, you get this Mithraic community where it's a doctor who's the head of it, which is quite interesting because that seems to be a very different the important aspects of the cult in that region were quite different to elsewhere.
No.
But I have to go back now and look at actually what kind of
be curious.
what the title his title actually was.
Yeah, I'd be curious because I didn't look into the 4th century stuff. But no, actually Gaul's really interesting because this is where we find a lot of medical tools in springs. So
Yeah,
and other objects associated with stamping eye medicines were also found. Not all of them, but a lot of them. Most of them are found in Gaul, and a number of them are found in water sources. So there is something in Gaul going on with water and the eyes. So.
Yeah, because I suppose like springs is like a big part of that, isn't it? Like the natural kind. Even nowadays, drinking spring water is always considered to be good for you.
Or going to spring baths. Go to Baden-Baden in Germany. It's built over the Roman baths, but you can still go there for healing. You can go there because it's very relaxing, but also I know people, if they have arthritis or pains, they are actually go and take these baths. It's a wonderful experience.
I might have to do it myself one day.
Yeah, I've
never actually done it.
Oh, yeah, it's wonderful.
People say as well, like Turkish baths, supposed to be quite nice. Different sort of thing, but I've never done that as well.
The nice thing about the one in Germany there I went to, because it was through my PhD research, it was in the middle of my PhD research, because I did this 6-week-long tour along the Rhine and the Danube, just visiting museums, and I thought, when I get to Baden-Baden, I am doing this bath. And you go through like a Roman bath, pretty much.
Oh, really?
So, warm room, hot room. They have a steam room, which is the natural springs, which isn't Roman, but then you go into the different pools, and then you have to do a cold plunge at the end.
Oh, wow.
So it was very relaxing. I can understand why the Romans did it.
But perks of the job, eh?
Yeah.
So, to what extent would you say do your interests outside of archaeology? Is there any overlap with your actual research? I mean, I know you kind of live by the mantra of kind of like healthy living, and as you said, like alluding to earlier, you're very active, particularly when it comes to things like sailing.
Yeah.
I mean, is that something that you see any sort of link there between your research?
Well, kind of. Just because I think the idea of getting outside, I have to do something physical. I've always been like that. But just this whole idea of being outside, it really does clear the mind. And I find that I'm much more able to focus after sailing, or at least the day after. It just takes your mind off everything. You have to focus. You're outside. You're you're surrounded by the sea, fresh air. And it's physical and mental, because you have to constantly focus on other boats. So from that perspective, I can't, it sort of links into that way. I have just a general interest in maritime history, but I would never want to write on it because it's just general, and sometimes I don't want to combine work and pleasure.
I mean, it's like in my case, I always find like the Tudors really interesting. I was saying a few weeks ago on the podcast, I think it was when Jay Inge was on, we were talking about it, and I was saying if I hadn't ended up being a Roman archaeologist, it probably been Tudor historian would have been the other way to go. But now it is quite nice because it's like I get to look at that stuff and read about it, but it is more for pleasure than it is actually for doing any research. I don't have to. I can listen to what other people have to say about it and be like, okay, and just agree. But I don't have to question it like I do with Roman archaeology. I mean, with the garden stuff, do you actually do much gardening yourself?
I don't have a garden, but what I do is a lot of floral arranging.
Okay.
When I was an undergraduate, I worked in a florist.
No way! My mum was a florist for years.
Yeah.
My mum,
Very pleasant job, actually. It smells really nice. It's very creative, and sort of gotten back into that actually. And then in October, I gave a talk at a sensory workshop in London, and I was just asked to talk about, they wanted me to talk about senses in gardens, but it was more for public thing. So actually I looked at how Romans may have made their floral crowns and made a few, and talked about the problems with experimental archaeology when doing that. But it was kind of fun because it was something I liked to do. Yeah. And I had to think about doing it. The Romans wouldn't have had wires or what modern florists do. And it's actually made me develop sort of sustainable crowns. So if you're ever interested, need any for
Start up a sideline business.
Actually, for Christmas I had a few
nice.
commissions. So I made all these sustainable garlands, which actually came from trying to figure out how the Romans might have done it. So,
Okay.
so there was a link, but going the other way.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's just because like talking to Ellen, talking to Joe Soner as well, where they're looking at stuff to do, particularly with material culture and use and reuse of it. How that's led to them having developed interest. Joe was saying last week that she's really developed a stronger interest now in craft because of it. It's interesting how that stuff feeds over. I mean, I actually worked part-time in a garden centre for years.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. I still know nothing about plants. I mean, I know odd things, bits and pieces. I was mainly just on the till.
Oh, okay, yeah.
It was nice. I mean, it was a nice place to work though,
Yeah.
because you could be outside quite a lot, and it was a little bit. I mean, where I live is I was saying earlier, it's kind of on the border of northwest Kent, southeast London.
Okay.
But it's in a weird little space where it's quite green. It's at the bottom of Shooters Hill in Welling, if anybody even knows what that is, which most people won't, but still. And there used to be, there's actually a farm next door. Yeah. There used to be donkeys, but they removed the donkeys and put them elsewhere. They turned it into a equestrian centre for the Olympics, but still horses there. But in any case, it was a nice place to work because it was, particularly in the summer, because you were outside and you get to walk around, you get to be active, I prefer doing that sometimes. I mean, like it's like kind of what we're saying, like academia. It's like I like doing research and teaching, but there are times where you're like, I just want to get outside. Yeah. And that's the good thing about archaeology, I guess, is it enables you to be outside.
Actually, that was one of the reasons I wanted to be an archaeologist, because as I said, I need to exercise, I need to be outside. And I have a love for history growing up, but the idea of just sitting inside all the time, I think I would go crazy. So that was one of the appeals of becoming, doing archaeology in the summer or, over the weekends or whatever.
Yeah, I had a similar thing because I grew up doing a lot of things like scouts.
Okay.
So archaeology was that kind of intersection between being outside a lot and liking history.
Yeah.
It was, I like reading about history and watching films or whatever about it. But yeah, I like to actually do something with it that's quite active as well and being outside. Because you've worked on a number of excavations. I mean, I know you were in the Swiss with Switzerland with mutual friends of ours with Neil Christie and Chantal. How was that actually?
It was fun. It unfortunately never worked out. It came about because I did a teaching exchange at Virginia Tech, and they have a study center in Switzerland. Lovely, nice Italian villa. And Glenn Bew, the person I did the exchange with, wanted to carry on trying to do some work with Kent, and we tried to get some kind of program running there. And I knew Chantal knows the area and loves it, and so I thought of her. And then we did a little bit of this church survey, but we just couldn't get the funding. Or really, what we needed to do was find Swiss collaborators. And we didn't. No one was interested. So
I would imagine they'd have a lot of money as well.
No. But they kept saying they didn't. But they really want collaboration, and everybody we approached just kept saying no. So it didn't work out in the end. But we did do one season, so that was fun. I've worked near Lake Garda with Neil, with an Italian group for a couple of years, working on a multi-period hilltop site, and took a few Kent students there. I've worked on prehistoric sites. I did a Roman field system in 2002 in Avebury with some Kent students. Prior to that, I worked on Hadrian's Wall, the South Shields.
So is that part of the Newcastle connection?
Yeah, that was all Newcastle. Actually, that's what brought me to Newcastle. I was doing my master's at Florida State, and because it was archaeology, I had to go abroad and work on a Roman or a Greek site. And I had started to develop an interest in life in the Roman army, which nobody does in America, or didn't at the time. And very few people do it now. There's a small group trying to learn about the provinces. So I was the odd one out, where I decided, well, I'll go to Britain and work on a Roman fort, where everybody else was going to sunny Greece and Italy. But I started working at South Shields and did that. And then I thought, well, if I really wanted to study this, I can't stay in the States. So it was working at the site. So I saw the university, there were people at the time. And when I went to Newcastle, I did a second master's in Roman frontier studies, again, because we just weren't taught that. I was teaching myself along with doing classical archaeology, languages and history at Florida. And then did a second master's in Newcastle just to really get the background in the frontiers. and then decided I had an interest in ancient medicine. I had read a few books and thought that's interesting. Came up with this question about the army. And it turned out that the year I decided to do my PhD, although I started out in archaeology, my first supervisor died.
Oh, really? Oh,
yeah.
right.
And then they gave me somebody as a temporary measure. But then there was somebody who had just been hired in classics who was working on ancient medicine. So it just, Philip van der Eyck, who is now Humboldt professor in Berlin. But it was just like, he's the obvious person. Even though he wasn't an archaeologist, it was really good to have somebody who looked at the literature, and it just came together perfectly. So it was just that, where everything has its time and place. So, yeah.
Well, I mean, my first question about that is, how was it acclimatizing to the accent in Newcastle in town?
I still don't know.
I went up there a few years ago to do some research, to go look at the Mithraea.
Yeah.
And I just remember being at McDonald's in Newcastle, and I actually had to ask the person 3 times what they were saying to me. I find it harder sometimes to understand people from up north than I do from other countries. It sounds really bad, but
no, it's funny. I love the accent, but it is difficult if I haven't grown up with it. And some, I was getting better at it, but some people have very strong accents, and I love listening to it, but I don't know what some of them are saying.
How is it as well, like, in terms of making that transition from the States to the UK? I mean, what are some of the notable differences? I think you're the first person I think I've spoken to for the podcast that's really come from basically from a different country into the UK system. So, I mean, you mentioned earlier that for one thing in the States that people aren't, there's not a tremendous amount of scholarship that focuses on the Roman army, but are there other things at all that are quite notable?
Let's start off. My undergraduate degree, I'll start with that. It was quite different from undergraduate degrees here. First of all, it's 4 years. And then although my BA was in anthropology, because I was curious about archaeology. So in America, you do anthropology unless you do a classical archaeology, which is quite interesting because I didn't realize that when I was applying for universities, but I think that was a good thing not to realize. So by doing archaeology under anthropology, it's really opened my eyes up to theoretical applications, different types of questions, different ways of thinking. And then I can apply that to the traditional classical archaeology, which was at the time, it's starting to change now, very art-based, looking at sculpture and that. So it was much more art historical than it was social anthropology. So, but anyway, going back, my BA was anthropology with a history minor. And then I did classical languages, but it was a liberal arts education. So I had to do sciences, math, languages, other humanities, other social sciences. So it was, broad. We even had to do physical education.
Oh, wow.
Which was, again, useful because it's, mind and body.
Yeah.
And so that was, and also what I think most of my students would hate here, I could not graduate without doing a public speaking class.
Oh, wow, yeah.
Everybody, and they still have it as a requirement. I always check.
I've spoken to people about this before, and people have raised this point that I think that's not a bad thing to have, though, because I think that is a very important aspect. It's something very important to learn.
Yes.
And I think there is a very notable, and I think everybody can attest, anybody who's been to a conference where you have people from the UK and people from the States talking, there is notable differences that exist. And I think that is, as you say, partly stems from the fact that in the States people have to do public speaking as part of their tuition. And over here, we don't put so much onus on that, which it does lead to a notable contrast. I don't know it would be very popular, but
it wasn't. No one wanted to do it, but and I actually held out to the very last semester to do it, which was, probably not the best thing, but I was really scared. But then I had a fantastic teacher, and it was such a nice class, and everybody was supportive of each other. I think because we were all frightened to death that we had to do this. And you would stand up there, you'd give your 2-minute talk, then a 5-minute talk, then your 10-minute final talk, and then little talks in between. And the teacher would tell you right then and there in front of everybody. You would get constructive criticism. Oh, you speak too quickly. I know I always still do that, but not as bad as I used to. And, I could give a whole talk without breathing. But, it was things like that. And then we would just make a joke out of it. And it was nice. It was fine. In fact, it was one of my favorite classes in the end. So.
Yeah. It's fascinating as well, because when you study the ancient world, you're studying people where rhetoric was so important. Public speaking was a public aspect of it, and then you get, so it's like you could say like the sensory experience of sound, of projecting sound, and also hearing sound, how that feeds into it. Any other kind of differences at all?
So the liberal arts thing is big. That was one that is massively different. Then when we start to really specialize is in our MAs. MAs are 2 to 3 years, because you are specializing and they are training you to be an academic big time. So that was pretty hardcore, actually. The master's was hard, and we had to pass. Not only did I have to pass Greek and Latin exams at master's level, postgraduate level, I had to then had to pass 2 foreign language written exams to show that I could read. So I had to did German and French. You cannot graduate without those, so it takes longer to do that.
Oh. Yeah, I think that is a big difference, because I've said this before as well. In Britain, we obviously don't really tend to promote here much in terms of learning other languages. Yes. I mean, when you go to university, like if you come to Kent, you can learn Greek and Latin, and you can do modern languages. But at school, I mean, I did French at school all the way through. We did German for a few years, and I did Latin as well. But there is that general apathy from not everybody, but quite a lot of people about learning other languages, because everyone's going to speak English anyway. Yeah. And then as you starting to get older, you're like, oh, I know. This sort of, then you're suddenly having to backtrack and starting to teach yourself, and you're like, oh man, I wish this had, like German. I wish I'd carried on doing German all the way through school, and because then I would have saved myself spending the last few years spending like many an evening on things like Duolingo trying to like improve my German. But
I'm really glad I did it, because I had so much German to read, and then I had to read some Dutch as well, and because I knew the German grammar, you can sort of, and then just getting a teach yourself Dutch kind of book, it wasn't too bad. It was pretty easy to make that transition. So it was, again, very useful. Since I didn't do my PhD in the States, I did it here, but there are differences with that, because you have to do exams and you do some coursework. So it takes longer to do the PhD anyway. And then, so you have to go through more training, exams, and then you do your PhD, your actual thesis.
So it's a lot more intense in the States overall, like a lot more intense. I mean, obviously it's intense here, but I mean, there's a lot more almost checkpoints that you have to reach in the States, and it takes a length of time to do so as well. Yeah,
I mean, it does take a lot longer.
But I guess they're very rewarding at the end of it all.
If you get a job.
Well, yeah. You've got a tremendous amount out of it, at least, though, in any case. So, I mean, in terms of the actual study of the ancient world and / archaeology, what do you think the subject could do to, I don't know, I think improve itself is the wrong word, but, where could it go in future? What sort of avenues do you think?
Well, there's a lot. Definitely, there's much more that can be done with diversity. Diversity and inclusivity is such a huge topic now, and everybody has to build it into their work programs. But I think specifically for classics and what's just recently happened at the AIA meeting, which I'm sure you've heard about.
Oh yeah. I saw it all going down on Twitter.
It was a horrible thing that happened, but in a way, it needed to be exposed, because if you look at traditional classics and classical archaeology, it's a very elitist, white, male-based area of study, and it was, the ancient world wasn't like that. It was a very diverse society with lots of different large social strata. Women were there, children, people with disabilities. It's starting to be explored, but I think there's a lot more that could be done with that, and then actually be taught at school level. And, these larger classics conferences or history conferences or whatever should expose the fact, make that more public as well. But, the ancient world was not just, men marching around in their military uniforms or wearing togas. So there's more. I mean, there is a lot more work has been done on women and gender, of course, but still more could be said or made public. I think it's the idea of, if people are studying this stuff, get it out there. Let the schools know. Because once people realize how diverse the world is and was, I think that's a good thing it could do. In terms of environmental sustainability, Romans made mistakes as well, but there's something that could be done with that.
I remember a few weeks ago on the podcast talking to Sadie Watson from Mola, and Sadie was saying about how she was in the States and she gave a talk to a group of school kids, and it was kind of in the southern half, I can't remember exactly where she was, but kind of with that kind of history of segregation very much apparent. And talking about people like Septimius Severus coming out of North Africa and ruling the Roman world, like the kids were just like, what? It's incredible. Like I suppose in some respect, almost stuff like that, even when you're in the academic bubble, you take for granted. And you don't realise the impact that it could have on other people when they comes to that realisation that the ancient world isn't the way they've seen it. Obviously, like through particularly things like sword and sandal epics and the way it's presented in that it's, as you say, a much more diverse place. And there's, I said that I was find it fascinating that you have with him at one point an emperor from North Africa whose sons are half Syrian. It's that sort of thing, particularly in kind of modern world with the current situation. I think is a very interesting story to tell.
I think that's something that could be done. I mean, when I told you I was just speaking at my nephew's school, I was talking to 11 and 12-year-olds about ancient medicine. It was very basic. But what I could do with them was just talk about, children's medicine in the ancient world, and that got them fascinated. And they could think about differences that way. And I was like, if you're a boy, if you're a girl, this was, how they were thought about. So it gets them thinking about gender roles differently. And even at that age, just what are these little differences?
The cogs start turning.
You can see they ask great questions. Look, it's
and they'll carry that stuff with them for a long time. It will really have a big impact on them. You've got some stuff that's come out recently published-wise. Where can people find that stuff? The
most recent should be out soon, as in World Archaeology. There's an edition on medicine, archaeology and medicine. There will be a book coming out looking at, it's just more of a general book on medical tools. I just studied an unpublished set of medical objects, but then explained all the different things you can do, and I got to use the XRF machine on them as well.
Oh, nice.
So that was something that you don't get to do on medical tools, which was quite nice.
When's that book coming?
I think it'll be at the end of the year. It's with it's published by Laurence Totalon, who's a specialist in ancient medicine as well. So that's coming out. They're the two most recent things, and otherwise it's working on this garden book.
And setting up a sideline business in
floristry,
Floristry as well. Brilliant.
Based on Roman designs.
It sells. Cool. Right.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Sure. Thank you. That was fun.